So we're doing Matt. He rushed home from work to do it. Okay.
Hey, are we doing this on Skype?
Yeah, No, we're going to do it on the phone because we had to... That voice that you just heard belongs to Matt Stoller. Matt Stoller is a policymaker focusing on industrial organization, monopoly power, and market structure. Sounds really boring, but he's actually really interesting. He writes for places like the New York Times, The Nation, The Atlantic. He talks to us about the rise of Trump and which narratives need to be killed, and he's willing to kill them with his own bare hands. But before we speak to Matt, we talk identity politics with Leslie Lee. And our hot take of the week is that Bernie Sanders is the wokest, most intersectional politician alive. Make sure you go on to patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show. Again, that's patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show. You're going to get bonus content, including an extended interview with none other than Matt Stoller. More things to look forward to are great videos, extended interviews with Leslie Lee, follow-up interview with Ben Jealous, and a very happy belated birthday shout-out to Darius Engel, a loyal supporter of The Katie Halper Show, a man with truly exquisite, exceptional taste. Happy birthday! He turned an age I won't mention on November 25th. If you'd like your own personalized birthday shout-out, and this time we promise we will try to do it on time and not late, then support The Katie Halper Show at the $13 level. Plus, we'll give you a Twitter follow. Hello and welcome to the Katie Halper Show. I'm your host, Katie Halper, and as usual, I'm here with the lovely and succulent. Why did I call you that?
Oh, yes, the delicious Gabe Pacheco right here.
Right here. Very funny man, has a show, a comedy show. Funhouse
Comedy in Williamsburg, Pete's Candy Store.
Every Wednesday. And all of our listeners, take note. You've been warned. You should be subscribed to us on Patreon. Patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show. You get extra goodies. We posted some extra nuggets from our interviews with Ben Jealous and our interview with Dea Schlossberg and Nisa Seneca. So make sure you're on there. We're really excited. We're gonna try to take on the very simple task of taking on identity politics. We're gonna be talking to Leslie Lee, and you may remember him. He's been on our show. He did a live show and an audio show, and he is the creator of the hashtag Bernie Made Me White. And he's also a writer, and he's in the D.C. area. Leslie, welcome.
Oh, thank you for having me. Nice to be with you, delicious Gabe, and I guess vicious Katie Halper.
Ooh,
vicious and delicious.
I like that.
Yeah,
vicious and delicious.
That sounds like a tag team from like the Glorious Ladies of Wrestling era.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It was actually WCW, but close enough.
Oh, wow. Oh, that was the extent of my wrestling knowledge. Professional wrestling is GLOW. Glorious Ladies of Wrestling. That's all I followed. So,
and you know it's coming back, right?
That's right. They're going to make
Netflix
a TV show about it.
Back. Yeah.
Also, you're really into comic books, right?
A bit. I haven't been into comics since they got all woke, and now like Spider-Man is a black guy. I'm not really into that. I wish they had done something with the actual superheroes that were already black instead of making all the main properties, a black woman, Hispanic, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
But I think that kind of relates to what we're going to be talking about today as far as identity politics goes.
I'll just set us up with that. What happened was Bernie was at Berkeley College in Boston.
By the way, thank you all for sending Elizabeth Warren to the U.S. Senate.
And a Latina woman, asked him for advice about how to run for office and be successful.
Rebecca says, I want to be the second Latina senator in U.S. history. Any tips?
And he said,
let me respond in a way that the questioner may not be happy with. It goes without saying that as we fight to end all forms of discrimination, as we fight to bring more and more women into the political process, Latinos, African Americans, Native Americans, all of that is enormously important, and count me in as somebody who wants to see that happen. But it is not good enough for somebody to say, hey, I'm a Latina, vote for me. That is not good enough. I have to know whether that Latina is going to stand up with the working class of this country and is going to take on big money interests. Yep. Now, one of the struggles that we're going to have right now, let me lay it on the table in the Democratic Party, It is not good enough for me to say, okay, well, we got X number of African Americans over here. We got Y number of Latinos. We have Z number of women. We are a diverse party, a diverse nation. Not good enough.
Right.
We need that diversity. That goes without saying. That is accepted. Right now, we've made some progress in getting women into politics. I think we got 20 women in the Senate now. We need 50 women in the Senate. We need more African Americans. But here is my point, and this is where there's going to be a division within the Democratic Party. It is not good enough for somebody to say, I'm a woman, vote for me. No, that's not good enough. What we need is a woman who has the guts to stand up to Wall Street, to the insurance companies, to the drug companies, to the fossil fuels. In other words, one of the struggles that you're going to be seeing in the Democratic Party is whether we go beyond identity politics. You know, yeah, I think it's a step forward in America if you have an African-American head of CEO of some major corporation. But you know what? If that guy is going to be shipping jobs out of this country and exploiting his workers, doesn't mean a whole hell of a lot whether he's black or white or Latino. All right? And I know, some people may not agree with me, but that is the fight that we're going to have right now within the Democratic Party. The working class of this country is being decimated. That's why Donald Trump won. And what we need now are candidates who stand with those working people, who understand that real median family income has gone down, that young people in many parts of this country have a very limited future, that life expectancy for many workers is going down. People can't afford health care, can't afford their medicine, can't afford to send their kids to college. We need candidates black and white and Latino and gay and male. We need all of that. But we need all of those candidates and public officials to have the guts to stand up to the oligarchy. That is the fight of today.
Wow, Katie, I've never heard something more racist in my life.
Yeah.
I'm so offended by that spiel. I'm joking, of course, but that was basically the reaction a lot of our favorite liberal pundits had. And I want to say that I don't take their objections seriously. I think they are being deliberately dishonest when they respond to that way. I think a lot of people take them in good faith. I don't. I think the Marcotts, the Jill Filipoviches, even the Joan Walshes. I like Joan Walsh, but she was incredibly dishonest about this. Josh Marshall of Talking Points Memo. They all deliberately took Bernie's word, basically twisted them to say that we don't care about identity politics anymore, or we need to do away with identity politics. Right. He doesn't say that. He doesn't hit to that at all. He says the exact opposite. Totally. In fact, he's quite clear about that earlier comment they had. He basically said, first we have to end sexism and racism, and there can be no compromise on that. He was very clear about that issue.
It's really important, I think, that we look at the syntax of the sentence. He said, of course they're important, of course they're necessary, but they're not enough. He says we have to go beyond, which literally means, right, if we break it down into the philosophy, it means that identity politics are necessary but insufficient, right? Like, those are good. Absolutely. We need them, but they're not enough. And in theory, people should get this and agree with this.
Aren't you saying that Clarence Thomas being a Supreme Court justice isn't enough?
Being black isn't enough, exactly.
Aren't you saying that Condoleezza Rice being Secretary of State isn't enough?
Yes.
Aren't you saying that Colin Powell being Secretary of State isn't enough?
Right.
What was Condoleezza Rice, by the way?
She was Secretary of State.
Nice.
Right?
Liberals understand this when it's a Republican, when it's Michelle Bachmann running for president. They don't go out and support her because she's a woman. They understand that she is not fighting for people. She's fighting for corporations. And she doesn't just not deserve our support. She deserves our derision for that.
Opposition, whatever,
the same rules have to apply to Democrats.
Right. I mean, I think that often when I'm talking about this stuff and people don't get it, I bring up Margaret Thatcher, and then people are saying like, oh my God, how can you compare Margaret Thatcher to Hillary Clinton? Sure, they're very different. but it's still, I think it drives home the concept of why gender or identity does not supersede political conviction. What happened was what TPM did. Remember, he says that they are necessary, that they're good. Of course, we have to have them, but we have to go beyond them, right? So at TPM, the headline they used was Sanders urges supporters ditch identity politics and embrace the working class. And it says in a speech Sunday, Senator Bernie Sanders urged attendees to move away from quote-unquote identity politics and towards policies aimed at helping the working class. Now, what's interesting, of course, is that several other places picked up this headline, even though, again, ditch has a very different connotation, right? Ditch means you're throwing away and you're abandoning it. He was not saying abandoning it. He's saying you use it, you keep it, it's a good thing, and you have to go further. So not surprisingly, of course, Matt Iglesias at Vox writes, Democrats neither can nor should ditch identity politics. Then we have Bustle. What they did is literally just copied and pasted TPM's headline into their opening. So Bustle literally says, speaking at an event, Senator Sanders urged supporters to ditch identity politics and embrace working class politics. That's literally what the headline of TPM is. So they plagiarized TPM. But again, if you click on the link, it sends you, let's say you're reading Bustle, you click on the link, it sends you to TPM, and you see TPM says the same thing. So clearly it's true, right? It's not just one source getting it wrong. Of course, what happened was a couple days later, you had Michelle Goldberg on All In with Chris Hayes. And she literally said that Sanders wants to ditch identity politics. Chris Hayes said, well, that's not exactly what he said, but you could barely hear him saying that. Nina Turner, she said, that's not what he said, but you could barely hear it. So it's just an example of how it goes from one place to another.
Yeah, talk about fake news.
Yeah.
I guess it's not just the Russians. And the worst part about these sorts of smears is that they start from all these disingenuous people, but then people who are, actually genuine read them and believe them, because who's going to click 5 links down to find a link to the tweet of the person who posts the whole transcript? Almost nobody.
Right. Yeah.
All they're going to see is that headline about Bernie Sanders wants to ditch identity politics, and the damage is done. And
right.
That's it.
And, we saw this. You remember when Yamiche Alcindor, New York Times reporter, asked Bernie Sanders if it was sexist for him to not drop out?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
That was June 6th.
What you said over there, that you staying in the race is sexist because you're standing in the way of what could be the first female president.
Is that a serious question?
Yes, it is a serious question.
That any woman who is running for president, anyone who opposes, your question implies that any woman who is running for president is by definition the best candidate. So any woman who runs.
But you would also have
to say that it is sexist, so if Hillary Clinton runs for president, is your point that it is sexist for any man to oppose her?
No, my point is that if she has more delegates than you tomorrow.
Well, that's another point.
We see what happens with people picking up narratives and headlines. And what happens is when Yamiche Alcindor asked Bernie Sanders about whether it was sexist, she tweeted this: some women think Bernie Sanders will be standing in way of history tomorrow if HRC wins and he doesn't concede. He got testy when I asked. Oh, well. Now, that's a New York Times reporter, and that's clearly a very personal, subjective thing, right? So what happens? She tweets that out. TPM's headline: Sanders gets testy after a reporter asks if he's sexist for opposing Clinton. They don't put testy in quotes. They just literally copy and paste the word used in this tweet as if it's an objective secondary source and not a woman who was describing what she felt like happened to her.
Talk to her about that.
Really?
She didn't. I tweeted her about. She's actually very, approachable. I tweeted her about it, about how angry it was, and I actually said that she made me embarrassed for all black journalists, which may have been a bit harsh.
Yeah.
But we got to call our own sometimes like that, and she didn't really have a good answer. She basically went back to that language of, well, people are saying this, so that's why I asked it, and that's not good enough.
She did the right thing. You don't understand. She did the right thing, man. It's so important. Sex sells. Sexism sells. You want to get ladies to read articles. We need to get everybody's blood temperature up and rising. All the identity politics is where it's at, man. I feel like, Katie, you and I should be doing more stuff here around that. And the working class, when people talk about that, all I hear is white people.
Yeah,
I don't hear, because there are no gay people in the working class.
That's true.
There are no Asians in the working class. There's never been a Native American in the working class.
Not once.
Black people, not part of the working class.
It's a glass ceiling for these people.
Yeah.
They don't
I get
into.
it. I'm all in.
Did you know that
Lean
you're
in.
racist if you imply that even a single black person has been poor?
Oh,
because
I know.
that's happened a few times this election cycle.
Right. I mean, pick a narrative. Either
Obama's been in office. All the memes show me
exactly.
that black people are prosperous beyond our wildest dreams.
Right.
And ours, I mean, the United States' wildest dreams.
I hate that liberalism that like thinks it's woke to sugarcoat stuff. Like, what do you want us to address and acknowledge institutionalized racism, or pretend that it doesn't exist? I mean, I get it that you don't want like a white person to ask you about like, oh, so tell me about the slaves in your family or whatever. Although I've used that, it's great on dates.
Yeah,
real good icebreaker. Let me tell you, especially when they're Scandinavian.
First thing you do is you show them your Ancestry.com like results, and then you go through each little part of your drop of your blood and try to just have a narrative for it.
Yeah, but speaking of that, like I'm gonna share a black secret with y'all and on the radio. Like most white people don't know this.
Okay.
We have this concept called bougie, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we say these bougie word for black people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like every time there's a pushback when people talk about the poverty black people face, it's mostly people that other black people will call bougie, right?
Mm-hmm.
People who are, privileged, basically. They're black, they still suffer from racism, all that good stuff. We're not denying that. But they're people of privilege, or people who have achieved privilege and now want to present this image of themselves that is separate from the underprivileged black folk.
Right.
And it's more important to them that they present this image of themselves than it is that poor black folk actually get addressed and talked about and have their needs met. And it's a really, and the problem with it is so many of these people are in the media. I think it's almost exclusively these people who you're going to see on CNN or on MSNBC, or even if you get down to like Slate, you're not reading from poor black people. You're not hearing from poor black people. Poor black people are silent in this country. There's only because we don't have time to start podcasts necessarily. We don't have money or that access to the circles in Washington or New York or Los Angeles that gets you a writing job at this place or that place. So poor people, white people too, are just basically invisible and are erased from this conversation. But what liberals can do, they can make themselves feel better by promoting, certain black voices who come from that more privileged class, or women who are more privileged than maybe the average woman is, and it's this representational type of identity politics, but that it doesn't speak for the people down at the bottom.
Right. So basically what we're getting at here is it doesn't matter what color or gender the boss is, there's still a boss, and bosses are terrible because they're oppressing their employees in certain systems, like present day post-industrial capitalism in the United States.
But we may not be able to. I mean, just so people don't write us off as really utopian. Even if we keep the boss system, right? We still want to have more equitable stuff, right? And unionization or whatever. So, I think that, the neoliberal is a neoliberal. It doesn't matter what color the neoliberal is, right?
Yeah, and that's all Bernie said. All Bernie was saying was, we don't need any more sellouts in the Democratic Party.
Right.
Because the only people who like sellouts are other sellouts. The people don't like sellouts. They know they're sellouts. That's why they didn't vote for Hillary. They know she's a sellout. They're not going to vote for Cory Booker. They know he's a sellout, and he's not going to fight for them. They knew Hillary Clinton wasn't going to fight for them. It doesn't matter what color, what creed, what race, what gender, what identity that person has. If you're putting them up there and they're not fighting for people, they will not vote for them. And that's why Trump won, because in spite of all the other things he said he would fight for people. He said this over and over again. That's how he was able to win votes from people who voted for Barack Obama 2 times.
Right.
Because Barack Obama said the same thing. He would fight for people, and even if he necessarily didn't live up to that, at least he said it. Hillary Clinton never said it. She said, everything's fine. America's already great.
Right.
You should vote for me because this other guy is dangerous and doesn't know what he's doing. I know what I'm doing.
Right.
Like, that's a good. and she just basically dropped her resume off and said, I'll see you on Monday. That's how she thought she was going to get this a job. She thought it was a job, but becoming the president is not a job. It's not something you just earn through seniority. You have to inspire people. You have to tell people you will fight for them. Otherwise, they're not going to get out of bed and vote for you.
Right.
Yeah, how did she not know that it was a popularity contest being married to Bill Clinton? I have no idea how she thought she was going to get by on just a resume.
So, and another interesting thing is that Michael Arsenault, and it said Bernie Sanders still says class is more important than race. He is still wrong. Where does he say class is more important than race? Where does he say that?
He says it with his skin. The fact that he's a socialist.
Yeah,
the fact that he's a male,
with his penis, his white penis.
Yes.
Pink colored. Oh God!
I was thinking ivory, like elephant tusk.
Oh my God! Awful.
So it has to be pointed out, like the accusation, centrists and liberals always make to the left is that we want to make it about class instead of race and sexism and just about class, but it's the exact opposite. What happens is whenever we talk about class, they immediately try to muddy the water by saying we aren't talking about race or we don't care about race or calling, as some did, Bernie Sanders a white supremacist.
Oh my gosh,
and a sexist.
Yeah.
Yeah, people actually said those words about him for that speech. To be pointed out, none of these people we're talking about, complaining about, maybe not everyone who's listening to the radio knows who, Amanda Marcotte is. But none of these people are leftists, right?
Right.
They're not to the left of Bernie Sanders. So when they're all in unison attacking him for these minor things, they're not doing it because they want to push him to the left. They're doing it because they don't want the Democrats to be pushed to the left.
Right. And
they're doing it because they want things to stay towards the center and towards the right.
Right. Also, I mean, the thing is that nobody says is that Bernie Sanders is actually way more intersectional than Hillary Clinton. I mean, Bernie Sanders sees the way that these things relate to each other. Hillary just tokenizes with her abuela thing and just tokenizes with, compare what Bernie Sanders was saying, right? Which was explicitly identity politics are important. We need more diversity. We have been moving towards diversity. We need more of that, but it's not enough. Compare that to what Hillary Clinton said at a speech in March where she said,
if we broke up the big banks tomorrow, and I will, if they deserve it, if they pose any systemic risk, I will. Would that end racism? No. Would that end sexism? No. Would that end discrimination against the LGBT community? No. Would that make people feel more welcoming to immigrants overnight? No.
She does two things here. One is she explicitly pits them against each other as if the fight against racism and the fight against banks are mutually exclusive. But she also, Sanders at least says, yeah, there's sexism, there's racism, and we need to have more diversity, and that's not a question. But we also need to make sure that we have policies that fight for working people. Hillary doesn't even say that. She's like, if they pose a systemic risk. So for her, she doesn't even admit the classism is there.
All this hubbub really is, it's about distracting people from moving to the left. They don't want people to talk about class at all. They don't want people to talk about class and race. They want people to not talk about class at all and to just talk about race, but only in these very facile ways, like, say, having a black Spider-Man and pretending like that is important, even though Marvel is, a massive corporation owned by Disney, and them having a black Spider-Man in a comic book really doesn't help a whole lot of black people, especially when Marvel had no black writers whatsoever at the time they did it. And, when you look at these very representational ideas of identity, which I think we all get trapped in, we want to look at, like the Oscars. We want the Oscars to be representational, but we want black movies to be nominated, but what does that really do? Is that really helping? How many black people is that helping work? How many black directors are we going to put to work with that, as opposed to if we focused our energy in reforms that would help the working class, how many millions of people we could help with that? If we put the same amount of energy we put towards these kind of superficial ideas of representation and put it towards, real material, economic, class-based ideas of equality, we could accomplish probably a lot more than just, black superhero movies.
Right. No. I love the black superhero movies. Also, my favorite is when a politician tells me that we need to have a national dialogue around race.
Oh, my God.
Because I love that, because then they're really putting the onus and responsibility on me, the television viewer, and I feel like I just got to go out in the streets and find someone of a different hue and just be like, hey, man, it's time for us to have this national dialogue because HRC told me to do it.
Yeah, well, what about when Karen Finney is an HRC senior strategist, and during one of the many sessions in which we hear Clinton people explaining how they had nothing to do with the loss whatsoever, it's Bernie Bro's fault, it's Jill Stein's fault, she actually says, there's a lot of misogyny and sexism, and I think it shows that we really need to have a national conversation about this, about the opposition to having a first female president. It's like, wait, that was the conversation the entire election. Did you miss that? Like, wasn't gender, and I hate it. I sound like a reactionary man. Like, I always think we have to talk about this stuff, but this person happened to talk about it a lot and not. But
when
substance.
the people in power, or the people who are politically appointed to sort of lead and steer the nation, tell us that it's our job to have in the most vapid and vacuous way, it's absurd.
It's absurd. I mean, to me, everything that Bernie Sanders said was totally proven this week. Look at Donald Trump. Donald Trump named Nikki Haley to something important. She's Indian and awful. And look at this. Obama is so woke, right? He knows all the right words to say. He knows the nomenclature. He hasn't done anything about Standing Rock. That is an emergency situation. A woman, people are being tortured there and hooded. And a woman had her arm blown off. And her father said the other day, I saw a video of him, and he's saying the various people he holds responsible.
I think I hold the governor of North Dakota, the police, the National Guard. I think that they knew what was coming.
And he says, and even Obama, who I love.
Even President Obama, who I love, said 3 weeks ago, well, we're going to wait and see. There's nothing more to wait and see. These people need help. They need to defuse the situation before people die. And people will die if the situation isn't stopped. That's pretty clear.
And you have Obama making all these statements about Native Americans and not showing up.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we this has been proven before Bernie Sanders got in the race. Black Lives Matter didn't start under George W. Bush. It started under President Obama. There was a black face in the White House, the first black face that's in the White House, and still this mass movement of people fighting for their rights, of black people fighting for the rights of black people, had to start under him. So having, our black politicians and black CEOs is not enough and has never been enough. And the thing is, black people know this. How do we know they know it? Because they didn't come out and vote for Hillary Clinton, because they knew that she would not fight for them.
So,
that's all. And that was the context that was also missing from what Bernie was saying. Bernie wasn't being really proscriptive; he was being descriptive. He was talking about what had already happened. Why the Democrats lost is because they brought this woman, a politician, and they talked about identity politics and intersectionality, but they had no platform whatsoever that was directed at actually helping women, helping black people, helping Hispanic people, helping poor people, and helping working class people. And that's what we saw in the election, and that's why Bernie Sanders made those comments, because he doesn't want Democrats to keep making these same mistakes.
Right. He was not as critical, because what he didn't say is the way that they're exploited and weaponized, right? Because it's not just that it's not enough. It's that they can be really sordid and perverse in their use, because they can actually be used to give people cover to push things that a white person or a man couldn't do. Thomas Frank talks about in his book, Listen Liberal, he has a chapter called It Takes a Liberal. It's a similar concept. He's basically saying Bill Clinton could pass NAFTA in a way that a Republican couldn't, right? So these people play.
Yeah, and that's the whole thing. And the Clintons absolutely represent this in the worst, aspects. Bill Clinton's entire presidency was built on this on structural racism while having this cultural, cache of black coolness, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like he was called the first black president, but he was
By Toni
putting mentally disabled black men to death in order to prove his tough on crime bona fides. The crime bill, the welfare bill, this black people, the Clintons were very popular with black people, but that had an expiration date, apparently, obviously, as we saw in this election. And if Hillary Clinton had made any effort, to fight for black people, she might have won this, but she actually didn't. She only fought against Bernie Sanders and tried to take away his support that any black people who might support him. They attacked him for his civil rights work, which is bizarre. They said that his supporters were only white dude bros, which is, of course, was never true. But she never presented a positive case for what she was going to do for black people, and therefore black people did not show up in masses that they did for Obama, and she lost.
Right. Yeah, Ben Jealous, who we had on literally election day, said to us, one of the things he said, he wrote an article the next day about the resistance starts now and what to do with that. And one of the things he said is that in Florida, where she lost by 120,000 voters, there are 600,000 unregistered black voters. And those people would have overwhelmingly voted for her. And, the fact that they spent money on ads instead of registering those voters is a real shonda. I don't believe he used that word, but that's what we think. We have to have you on again. And where can people find you on Twitter?
You can find me at Leslie Lee III on Twitter.
Okay, great. Awesome.
All right, thank you so much for having me. It's great talking to you guys.
Bye, Leslie.
Bye. Matt Stoller is a budget analyst on the Senate Budget Committee and an amateur historian. And I bring up the amateur historian part because I think that we can't not look at the history, both like recent as in, what happened on election day, but also what led up to it. Like we can't not look at those things if we want to understand how Trump came to power and what forces have propped him up. And I think there's this really scary narrative that is so intellectually lazy, which is just like, oh no, they're just a bunch of racists. And they're too racist and too sexist. And that's why they didn't vote for Hillary Clinton. And so we just need to, and that in itself is like, I think, way oversimplifying. But then that combined with the idea that we should not cater to these people because we don't cater to racists, the only option with that you're left with is either armed uprising, which I don't think the people like Jamal Bowie writing about this in Slate are actually putting forward as an option or want to participate in, or we just wait for the demographics and these people to die out. But by then we'll have another Trump.
I'm a policy person, so I tend to think in terms of ideas and policy rather than elections. Generally speaking, the way I started writing about the rise of more authoritarian politics and populist politics in 2012, when I wrote a piece for the Fordham Law Review about the collapse of the housing finance system and what that meant. And what we're dealing with and what we have to understand about the Obama presidency, and I guess now pretty soon to be the Trump presidency, is a collapse of systems that were set up in the 30s and 40s that were built out of the collapse of the Great Depression and that were cemented in place to get rid of political instability that we were facing. So those systems were set up because, it was chaos and people were looking at Hitler and Mussolini and saying, well, that's our future unless we can figure out, and the Soviet Union, unless we can figure out some way of giving people the ability to rule themselves and to have freedom in both an economic and political. As those systems collapse, and they've been collapsing for about 40 years, but the spine of it was the housing finance system, and that snapped in 2008. What you've seen is more and more political instability and political establishment in both sides that are unwilling to actually deal with resurrecting some sort of social contract that people that is stable. And so when you see someone like Trump come into the picture, he is not. It's not that he won because you can pick lots of different reasons for why he won, but the reason that he was even close, the reason that he got to a position where he was able to get into power is because, the systems that we have in place to allow people to organize their own communities have fallen apart. So if we want to criticize Trump, we can, but you have to realize that the deep-rooted political power that he's wielding that comes from the collapse of these systems can only be combated by really putting forward an agenda that would resurrect some sort of social contract that is stable, that does allow for people to pursue economic and political liberties.
So you're against this idea that he's the great villain and like a great man of history narrative?
Well, I'm not actually against the great man theory of history or the great person theory of history.
So woke.
Because politics is opportunistic, right? And when these structures fall apart, it is people that rebuild them in one form or another. So, Germany collapsed, Italy collapsed, the U.S. collapsed, England collapsed, France collapsed. You saw different people, different opportunistic individuals choose different strategies for restoring social equity. All of them collapsed because of the machinations of bankers and essentially the unwillingness of bankers to look at more than just their own balance sheet. And that was what the interwar years of the 20s was about. And it was very similar to the 1990s and 2000s. And actually, you could go back to the 1980s as well. So what we're dealing with is a really dangerous moment. And sure, Trump could break a bunch of political norms and really restructure our political order, and we may not be able to do anything about that, no matter how hard we try. But then again, we might. And so how we respond to him is going to have, I think, significant impacts on what he does and what the political order looks like after he's gone or as he's setting it up.
Right. So what are the things that happened and the takeaways that we need to look at? What led to Trump's rise that will inform the way we organize?
There was a change in the 1970s. I'll go back to the 70s.
Okay.
And actually, I'll go to the 30s. So what happened in the 30s, because the system had been collapsed, is that the businessmen were running everything, right? And they said that is a problem. We need to look at these big corporations that are monopolistic. What they do is they gouge us out of cash with their monopolies, and then they use that cash to buy our democracy. And then they use that democracy to generate more ability to gouge us. And they said, we need to break that. And they set up what's called the New Deal to basically decentralize these corporations to fit the corporate form into our constitutional order. That's what FDR actually said. And that involved a whole set of policies, anti-monopoly policies and policies to force, Glass-Steagall was part of it, but basically to remove the ability of financial intermediaries to run our culture. So in the 1970s, the New Democrats, this generation that was weaned on campus activism of the 1960s, the New Left, came into power, and they largely rebelled against the New Deal because they saw the world differently, and they didn't think that banks and big corporations were particularly problematic because they hadn't been for 40 years. And then over the next, from basically the late 70s until the financial crisis, their ideology, which was neoliberalism, which is a very sort of with certain regulatory mandates and certain forms of identity being wedded to a very concentrated corporate structure. So let's reconstruct the trusts of the pre New Deal era, and let's put some regulatory mandates on top of that. That was their philosophy of how to run the world. It's how Clinton ran the world in the 1990s. It's the way that the Obama administration, who are the intellectual heirs to this tradition, thought about the world. It's why we built the ACA and Dodd-Frank the way that we did, which is very concentrated banks, very concentrated insurance companies and hospitals with regulatory mandates on them. It's why the administration was still pushing the TPP, because they see concentrated financial structures as the way to deliver social justice. So what that does is it does exactly what it did from the 1870s to the 1920s, is it subordinates our political identity to kind of financial intermediaries, and it creates instability in our political system. It also can have the effect of creating sectarian rivalries which is in America takes the form of racism, in other countries takes different forms, but it's usually some sort of tribal identity politics. And that's what we've seen. And we've seen it for 40 years, and it's gotten worse. And Trump's just the latest manifestation of it. But when you have a commercial system where, the hottest company of the last 10 years, the name is Uber, which is named after a Nietzschean term that inspired, fascism in Germany. That's a pretty dangerous political situation. And people don't usually look at the commercial sector as the progenitor of political ideas, or at least they don't today. But that is where a lot of our politics comes from. Every one of us is reliant on businesses for all of our political economy, for all our food, nutrition, so on and so forth, health, transportation. And so we ought to be thinking about those systems as political systems. That's what's happening, and that's what Trump ran on, and Clinton didn't run on that. So that's really what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a very autocratic commercial system that we've allowed to rise since the 1970s, and that has spilled over into the political sector. And if we want to deal with the autocracy that we're seeing all around us, then we have to deal with it in the commercial sector as well as the political sector.
So what does that look like policy-wise and organizing-wise? I know you're a policy person, you're not an organizer, but what are the takeaways in both of those spheres?
I don't know. I thought it just sounded good. No, I'm just kidding.
It does, yeah.
No, I mean, it looks like much more aggressive, anti-monopoly policy, much more aggressive. So to break up institutions across the economy, not just banks, but companies. You've got a whole set of institutions that dominate our commercial sector. The glasses have a monopoly. There's basically one company that makes and markets and sells glasses. There's basically one company or a couple of companies that make mattresses. There's like one company that does certain or few companies that do IT systems for hospitals. Not to mention telecommunications with cable and search and retailing with Amazon and Walmart. I mean, throughout the economy, there are all of these monopolies all over the place, and those need to be dealt with on a municipal level, on a state level, at every government agency, as well as the antitrust agencies. And organizers need to start thinking about going after those institutions and seeing those institutions as political, so that we can write rules like net neutrality or rules like that can actually make sure that we have an economy that is open for liberty for everyone. So I don't know. That's a very broad agenda, but that is the agenda that you need. And you need it in every sector of our political system. Like we have to see managing our commercial systems so that they promote competition and liberty as the core of what we do. There are lots of other important areas of how we think about social justice, and we must also incorporate them. But the heart of this country is commerce, and we cannot ignore commerce.
What are some of the most stubborn narratives that you think need to be killed in its sleep?
I think the notion that the bailouts were successful is a problem. I think the Democratic Party needs to recognize that the bailouts, the way that they were conducted, was a betrayal of democracy. And what you see in the generally speaking in our political institutions at a high level is a generalized belief that the bailouts worked and that they saved our economy. And what they did is they saved our financial institutions in a very concentrated form, but they sacrificed our democracy. And that is a narrative that we have not internalized because we have not held anyone accountable for those political decisions. Those were political decisions. So that's a deep narrative that we have to take on. The second narrative I would say we have to take on is the narrative that economists at this stage have expertise. Economists at this point are not experts. They are political consultants and political advocates who speak in a language of technocracy and do not disclose their clients.
Unlike other people, they have this image of objectivity and they present what they're doing as a science and as outside of ideology, right? Like post-ideology.
Right. I mean, you've got a whole industry of economists who spend their time taking money from corporations so that they will go to courts and say, this merger or that merger will not increase prices. And of course, the mergers do increase prices. You have economists who spend their time making observations, like a report just came out the other day saying, really weird thing. It turns out that imports from China have cost jobs, and that has health impact. It's like, oh, thank you for saying that in 2016.
Right.
Like normal people noticed that everything was made in China like 10 years ago, and corporate executives announced that they were going to make everything in China in the late 1990s. So this is embarrassing. And the institution of economics, I like economics. Economists have been essential in thinking about our culture. They used to be great in the 50s, but at this point, the institution of economics needs to be like radically restructured. I don't know how to do that, but until that happens, it is important for people to accept common sense over these institutions. The same thing's probably true of lawyers. I think that's another kind of, we need to take a very different attitude towards experts until, frankly, the experts clean up their own institutions. You know, the other thing is, I think it's really important for activists and organizers and just Democrats to stop saying, well, I don't know that much about that policy or that. You know, it's like, I'm not an expert in economics. I hear this all the time on economic matters. They're just like, well, I don't, you know, people get ashamed and embarrassed. They feel like they don't know. And you got to recognize that you do know, right? I've had a lot of conversations with people. People are generally pretty perceptive about political economy. You just have to learn a little bit and get more confident, because if you're not confident in what you want and what you think about the world, that vacuum will be filled for you by autocrats. First, you have to free your mind.
And the rest will follow. Be colorblind. Don't be so shallow. Might date another race or color. Doesn't mean I don't like my strong black brothers. You were getting to that, right, Matt?
No,
it's all about the end vote.
No, I mean, if you free your mind, they can still put you in prison.
Right, in fact. Right. That is what the rest will follow is about.
It's not a guarantee, but you can't start fighting for your freedom until you are confident enough to want it.
Matt,
you should enough to you can govern.
You should be a political analyst, motivational speaker. Seriously. That's amazing. I think people would come to you for both, and then you could kind of indoctrinate people as you're just teaching them to negotiate better with their bosses or whatever it is that people go to motivational speakers for. We should totally make some videos with Matt Stoller. That'll be viral. That'd be amazing. What do you think of?
Yes, motivational speakers.
Yeah.
Oh, so one last thing. I think there's one more narrative that I want to kind of
this
kill.
Is great.
And now that we're killing narrative. The tradition I'm talking about of populism is not a left-wing tradition, not a radical tradition. It sits squarely in the center of American politics. It is what we fought a revolution for. It is what we fought a civil war for. All right. So what we're talking about is American, right? It's centrist American political thought, and we have been robbed of it by these new left and new right radicals from the 60s who now sit in suits betraying everything America stands for and telling us that we're crazy. So that's the other thing is we are sitting in the center of American political traditions, and we should claim that.
So what does it mean, though? Right, what's the difference between being left populist and centrist populist?
Well, I don't know. I'm a populist. So the populism to me refers to a very specific historical moment, which is farmers in the late 1880s and 1890s who were, farmers or business people, and they were responding to the depredations of the railroads and the money trust that were charging them high interest rates and monopolizing all of their inputs while manipulating the prices at which they could sell their goods. And they were very upset about it, and they wanted open markets where they could sell into their goods. They wanted transportation systems that were not dominated by autocratic railroad barons, and they wanted a government that worked for them, for their democracy. And ultimately, their agenda was put forward in the 1930s after a lot of them had been wiped out. But that's what I think about when I think about populism. It was also a Southern and Western movement, and it was actually a pretty radically anti-racist movement in the 1890s. Although, the populists were the only party in the South. They were a third party that was actually that was against lynching, and they had they were, it was based out of a group of farmers called the Farmers Alliance, and they worked with what was called the Colored Farmers Alliance to try to break basically the terrorist state of Southern politics. They couldn't. They lost, but they tried. It was you can always go back, and obviously, like, one of the biggest problems they had is that, like, there was intense and insane amounts of racism, but there was also, like, there was just one of the things that happened is they had multiracial electoral victories, and then white supremacists who usually represented the economic elite would just murder everyone. They would just go through it, just murder all the newly elected officials. Like, this happened throughout towns in the South. I mean, it was like, it's insane to think about it, but, like, that is part of our history that we don't talk about. And guess what? Murdering the entire leadership of a political movement does actually make it hard to organize.
Right.
On
a metaphysical level.
We don't call that fascism, right? Because fascism is dated as a 1920s and 1930s movement, but that's what it was. Right? I mean, when people say it can't happen here or whatever, like, we've had fascism in this country. That is what fascism looks like. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. But I think about myself as a populist because I really look at what those farmers were doing and what they were saying, and the political movement they inspired, and the New Dealers ultimately took from that a lot of their policy ideas. And that's the tradition that I feel comfortable with. It's also a tradition that actually goes much further back than just the populist. There were populist type of advocates in the 1790s, in the 1820s, in the pre-Civil War era. So that's the tradition that I like, much more than the progressives.
Were you a big fan of The Wizard of Oz as a child?
I was not. I still have not been able to. I haven't really done any work on that, but somebody said that it was about the gold standard?
Yeah, it is.
Someone else was like, no, it wasn't true.
No.
Is it about the gold standard?
It is, yeah, and that's what the Yellow Brick Road is, and the silver is, the Tin Man is about the silver, and it's a big populist themed book. And then, although the word Oz, in case you're wondering, Frank Baum was telling kids a story. He was a big storyteller, and he made up the story about the land of Oz, the magical land of Oz, and he had to come up with a name for this kingdom, magical land, and he was sitting across from his filing cabinets, and one of the filing cabinets was O through Z, so it was O-Z, and that's why he called it Oz. Little nugget.
That's awesome.
It's awesome, right?
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And so what is the difference then for you between when you say populist versus progressive? And then I'll ask you about Paul Krugman and why Vox should be banned. Find out Mac's thoughts on Paul Krugman and why he identifies more as a populist than progressive. Subscribe to our Patreon at the $5 level.